Right, now let's get some analysis on this South African Airways story. The airline has suspended its acting CEO, and we get to talk to Guy Leitch, the editor of the SA Flyer magazine. Sir, thank you very much for your time. Was this a surprise? South African Airways receiving a bailout last year to the tune of 5 billion rand. It's alleged that it received 550 million rand just last week. There's endemic problems at the local airline.
There are endemic problems. I think, just to correct a couple of misconceptions, though, it didn't receive a 5 billion bailout at the end of last year. It received a guarantee, and it's drawing down on that guarantee now. It's been approved for 1.5 billion rand to draw down on that guarantee. And I think it's going to do that. The problem is that it was making 100 million rand a month, or perhaps even 200 million rand a month loss last year, and that was until its financial year end at the end of, I think, April. So, and it's probably making an even bigger loss now. It could well be making 200 million rand a month loss. Nothing's been changed because they're waiting to put in to get a new plan in place. So I think there are huge stresses in the organisation. It was probably inevitable that Kona, who had been put in as a temporary, was probably going to fall short.
Precautionary suspension. We don't know much detail. We know that he's being investigated. Was this a surprise to you?
It wasn't a surprise simply because he'd already rubbed heads with his boards. In fact, he hadn't had more than rubbed heads. He'd actually had a decision of his actually immediately rescinded or changed by the board. And this is interesting because the Minister Gigaba tends to think that his board can run the airline. In fact, the board can't. It's up to the CEO to run an airline, not actually a non-executive board.
And exactly, I mean, we saw the board actually literally just a massive exodus that occurred from what we saw last year. And the truth of the matter is they say that the Department of Public Enterprises is not giving enough support overall to South African Airways. Do you think that this is the fundamental problem, or do you think there's just too much push to get a different agenda into the company and not being run by the CEO?
I think it's both. It's the same. It's two sides of the same coin. I think that the state does have a political agenda which does make SAA inefficient, and they are continuing to push ahead with that agenda. For instance, the whole question of whether the airline should be privatized has been really dropped, has been put onto the back burner, and it's not a question at all any longer. There are structural inefficiencies in the organisation, most notably to do with overstaffing and simple inefficiencies in staffing. Whenever they get consultants in, they act as chainsaw consultants and cut away all the dead wood. We haven't, and that's what they're talking about doing now, although actually not. Now we're hearing that actually they're not going to get in consultants, they're simply going to rehash the best of all the past consultants' works. What I think is interesting at this stage is that they've asked Nico Vuyisile to step in as the acting CEO. Now obviously that's interesting from a number of points of view, at most superficially because he's a white male. It's obviously unexpected in terms of the whole affirmative action campaign that is burdening SAA at this stage. And we hear too, by the way, that they have cast their net as far abroad as the United States to get a new CEO. But I think what is interesting about Nico Vuyisile's temporary appointment is that the airline is looking to reincorporate Mango and SA Express back into the airline.
And it's interesting, Mango is actually quite profitable, so it's interesting that the sort of
I'm
dynamics.
afraid we don't know that.
Well, I mean, this is what Nico Vuyisile has been advocating for quite some time, that it is really doing well, that it is standing on its own 2 feet.
And it's standing on its own 2 feet with a lot of duplicated costs because it has to run its own training department, it has to run its own flight ops department, which the airline is doing as well. So if it incorporated those, it could save a lot of costs.
Okay, so Guy, before we say goodbye, very quickly, what does this mean for consumers?
It means that the airlines will continue to run inefficiently simply because we've got an enormous tax burden for SAA, and at this stage there isn't really a lot of room coming in for yet another low-cost carrier.
All right, things don't look good. Thank you, sir, for joining us. Much appreciated for your time. That was Guy Leitch, editor of South African Flyer magazine.